v. Mr. RNS's preface represents much that is of interest. It touches upon the broadest questions of political reforms in Russia, the various methods by which these reforms can be effected, and the significance of the various forces leading to these reforms. On the other hand, Mr. RNS, who apparently has close relations with liberal circles generally, and Zemstvo liberal circles in particular, undoubtedly sounds a new note in the chorus of our underground literature. Therefore, in order to clear up the question of the political significance of the Zemstvos in principle and to acquaint ourselves with the tendencies and, I shall not say directions, but moods, in the circles close to the liberals, it will be well worth our while to deal in detail with this preface and determine whether that which is new in it is positive or negative, and to what extent it is positive and to what extent negative and why. The fundamental feature of RNS's views is the following. As can be seen from numerous passages of his essay, quoted below, he favors peaceful, gradual, and strictly legal development. On the other hand, he rebels with all his being against the autocracy and yearns for political freedom. But the autocracy is an autocracy precisely because it prohibits and persecutes all development towards freedom. This contradiction permeates the whole of RNS's essay and renders his argumentation extremely illogical, hesitant, and unsound. Constitutionalism can be combined with solicitude for the strictly legal development of autocratic Russia only on the premise or, at least, on the assumption that the autocratic government itself will understand, grow weary, yield, etc. And Mr. RNS does, indeed, at times fall from the height of his civic indignation to the vulgar viewpoint of the most immature liberalism. Thus, he says of himself, "We who regard the struggle for civil liberties waged by politically conscious people in Russia today to be their vow of Hannibal, a vow as sacred as that taken by the men and women who fought for the emancipation of the peasants in the 40s and, again, however trying it is to those of us who have taken the vow of Hannibal to fight against the autocracy, etc." Well said, powerfully said. Powerful words like these would have been an embellishment to the article, if the same spirit of indomitable and irreconcilable struggle, the vow of Hannibal had pervaded it throughout. But these powerful words, precisely because they are so powerful, sound discordant when accompanied by a note of artificial conciliation and pacification, by an attempt to introduce, even with the aid of far-fetched interpretations, the conception of peaceful, strictly legal development. Mr. RNS, unfortunately, evinces more than enough such notes and such attempts. He devotes a page and a half, for instance, to a detailed argumentation of the idea that the policy of the state during the reign of Nicholas II deserves even severer, our italics, condemnation from the moral and political points of view than the wicked revision of the reforms of Alexander II carried out during the reign of Alexander III. Why severer condemnation? It appears that this is because Alexander III fought against revolution, while Nicholas II fought against the legal aspirations of Russian society. The former fought against politically conscious forces, the latter against quite peaceful social forces often acting without any clear political idea, hardly even realizing that their purpose of cultural work was undermining the state system to a considerable degree. This is untrue in point of fact, as we shall show further on. But apart from this, one cannot help noting the author's peculiar line of reasoning. He condemns autocracy, but condemns one autocrat more than another, not because of policy, for that has remained unchanged, but because he, allegedly, has no hotheads to contend with, such as, naturally, call forth sharp resistance, and, consequently, he has no occasion for persecutions. Is not such an argument an obvious concession to the loyal and humble contention that our father the Tsar need not fear to call together his beloved people because they have never dreamed of anything beyond the bounds of peaceful strivings and strict legality? We are not surprised to find such a train of thought or train of lies in the works of Mr. Witte, who writes in his memorandum, "One would suppose, when there are no political parties and there is no revolution, and when the rights of the supreme authority are not being challenged, that the administration should not be contraposed to the people or society. 17, etc. We are not surprised to meet with such arguments in the writings of Mr. Sheikh Haran, who, in the memorandum presented to Count Milutin after March 1, 1881, declared that the authorities must first of all display their energy and show that they have not lowered their flag in the face of danger, that the monarchical system is compatible with free institutions only when the latter are the fruit of peaceful development and the calm initiative of the supreme authority itself, and who recommended the establishment of a strong and liberal government functioning with the aid of a legislative organ strengthened and renovated by the elective element. 18. Now, it would be quite natural for such a Mr. Sheikh Haran to acknowledge that the policy of Nicholas II deserves greater condemnation, because under his rule peaceful development and the calm initiative of the supreme authority itself could have led to free institutions. But is it natural and decent to hear such reasoning from a man who took the vow of Hannibal to struggle? Mr. RNS is wrong in point of fact. Now, he says, comparing the present reign with the preceding one, no one thinks seriously of the violent overthrow wishfully imagined by the adherents of Narodnaya Volia. Parlez pour vous, monsieur. Speak only for yourself. We know quite definitely that the revolutionary movement in Russia, far from having died out or subsided in the present as compared with the previous reign, has, on the contrary, revived and become many times stronger. What kind of revolutionary movement would it be if none of the participants thought seriously of a violent change? The objection may be raised that in the quoted lines Mr. RNS has in mind, not violent revolution in general, but a specific Narodnaya Volia revolution, i.e., a revolution that will be both political and social at the same time, a revolution that will lead, not only to the overthrow of the autocracy, but to the seizure of power. Such an objection, however, would be groundless, first, because to the autocracy as such, i.e., to the autocratic government and not to the bourgeoisie or society, it is not important for what reason people want to overthrow it. Important is the fact that they want to overthrow it. Secondly, at the beginning of the reign of Alexander III, the Narodnaya Volia adherents presented to the government the very alternative that social democracy now presents to Nicholas II, either revolutionary struggle or the renunciation of autocratic power. See the letter of the Executive Committee of Narodnaya Volia to Alexander III, dated March 10, 1881, which put forward two conditions: 1. A general amnesty for all political offenders, and 2. The convening of an assembly of representatives of the entire Russian people on the basis of universal suffrage, freedom of the press, speech, and assembly. Mr. RNS himself knows perfectly well that many people, not only among the intelligentsia, but also among the working class, think seriously about a violent revolution. See page 6 et seq. of his essay, where reference is made to revolutionary social democracy, which possesses a mass basis and intellectual forces, which is advancing towards the decisive political struggle, towards the sanguinary struggle of revolutionary Russia against the absolutist bureaucratic regime peacefully. There is not the slightest doubt, therefore, that Mr. RNS's loyal speeches constitute a special method, an attempt to influence the government, or public opinion by demonstrating his or other people's modesty. Mr. RNS, by the way, thinks that the term struggle may be given a very wide interpretation. The abolition of the Zemstvo, he writes, will place a trump card in the hands of revolutionary propagandists. We say this quite objectively, without, on the one hand, experiencing repulsion against what is usually termed revolutionary action, or, on the other, being carried away with infatuation or admiration for this form, of struggle for political and social progress. This is a most remarkable tirade. If we remove the quasi-scientific formula, This inappropriate parading of objectivity, since the author himself mentions his preference for one or another form of activity or of struggle, the protestation of his objectivity rates in value with the statement, 2 and 2 equal 1 steer and candle, we shall find the hoary argument, gentlemen of the government, you may believe me when I begin to scare you with revolution, because my heart is not in it. His reference to objectivity is nothing more nor less than a fig leaf intended to conceal subjective antipathy to revolution and revolutionary activity. And Mr. RNS stands in need of a fig leaf, because such antipathy is totally incompatible with the vow of Hannibal. By the way, are we not making a mistake about this Hannibal? Did he really take a vow to struggle against the Romans, or only to fight for the progress of Carthage, which progress, of course, in the final analysis, would be to the injury of Rome? Can the term struggle be understood otherwise than in its narrow meaning? Mr. R.N.S. thinks it can. A comparison of the vow of Hannibal with the above-mentioned tirade yields the conclusion that struggle against the autocracy manifests itself in various forms. One form is the revolutionary, illegal struggle. Another form is struggle for political and social progress in general, in other words peaceful legal activity, which disseminates culture within the limits permitted by the autocracy. We do not doubt in the least that it is possible even under the autocracy to carry on legal activity which promotes Russian progress, in some cases fairly rapid technological progress, in a few cases insignificant social progress, and, in exceptional cases, political progress to a very slight extent. We may argue about the magnitude of this slight progress and the extent to which it is possible, the extent to which isolated cases of such progress are capable of paralyzing the mass political demoralization which the autocracy is constantly sowing among the population everywhere. But to include, even indirectly, peaceful legal activity in the conception of struggle against the autocracy means to facilitate this work of demoralization and to weaken the as it is infinitely weak consciousness of the Russian man in the street of his responsibility as citizen for everything the government does. Unfortunately, Mr. RNS is not alone among the illegal writers who seek to obliterate the difference between revolutionary struggle and peaceful uplift activities. He has a predecessor in the person of B.M., author of the article, Our Reality, published in the celebrated, separate supplement to Rabbo-Kayamuzl, 45 September 1899. In his controversy with the Social Democratic Revolutionaries, Mr. B.M. wrote, the struggle for the Zemstvo and for municipal self-government, the struggle for public schools, the struggle for public courts, the struggle for public aid to the famine-stricken population, etc., all represent the struggle against the autocracy. This social struggle, which for some unexplained reason fails to attract the favorable interest of many Russian revolutionary writers, is, as we have seen, being waged by Russian society, and not only since yesterday. The question now is how these separate social strata can wage the struggle against the autocracy most effectively. The principal question for us is how this social struggle against the autocracy should be waged by our workers, whose movement our revolutionaries regard as the best means of overthrowing the autocracy. Pages 8 and 9. As can be seen, Mr. R.M. does not bother to conceal his antipathy towards the revolutionaries. He openly characterizes legal opposition and peaceful activity as struggle against the autocracy. And the most important question for him is how the workers should conduct this struggle. Mr. RNS is not nearly so crude and open, but the kinship between the political trends of this liberal and of the ardent worshipper of the labor movement pure and simple, is very definitely apparent. 19. With respect to Mr. RNS's objectivity, we must say that he sometimes simply casts it aside. He is objective when he speaks of the working class movement, of its organic growth, of the future inevitable struggles between revolutionary social democracy and the autocracy, and when he states that the abolition of the Zemstvos will inevitably force the liberals to organize an illegal party. All this is set forth in a very businesslike and sober manner, so sober indeed that one can only rejoice that the working class movement in Russia is so well understood in liberal circles. But when, instead of fighting the enemy, Mr. RNS begins to talk about the possibility of submission on the part of the enemy, he forfeits his objectivity, gives expression to his real sentiments, and even passes from the indicative mood to the imperative. Only in the event of people being found among those in power courageous enough to submit to history and to compel the autocrat to submit to it, will the final and bloody struggle between revolutionary Russia and the autocratic bureaucratic regime be avoided. No doubt there are men among the higher bureaucracy who do not sympathize with the reactionary policy. These men, the only persons having access to the throne, never dare to express their convictions openly. Perhaps the enormous shadow of the inevitable, historic day of retribution, the shadow of great events, will cause the government circles to waver and will destroy the iron system of reactionary policy while there is yet time. Comparatively little is required for this now. Perhaps the government will realize, before it is too late, the fatal danger of protecting the autocratic regime at all costs. Perhaps even before it has to face revolution, it will grow weary of its struggle against the natural and historically necessary development of freedom, and will waver in its irreconcilable policy. If it ceases to be consistent in its struggle against freedom, it will be obliged to open the door wider and wider for it. It may be, no, not only may be, but so shall it be. Author's italics. Amen. Is all that we need add to this well-intentioned and lofty monologue. Our Hannibal makes such rapid progress that he now appears before us in a third form. The first was the struggle against the autocracy, the second, the spreading of culture, the third, appeals to the enemy to submit and attempts to frighten him with a shadow. How frightful! We quite agree with our respected Mr. RNS that the sanctimonious hypocrites of the Russian government are sooner frightened by shadows than by anything else on earth. Immediately prior to conjuring up shadows, our author, in referring to the growth of the revolutionary forces and to the impending revolutionary outbreak, exclaimed, "We foresee with profound sorrow the horrible price in people and in cultural forces that will have to be paid for this madly aggressive, conservative policy which has neither political sense nor a shadow of moral justification." What a bottomless pit of doctrinarism and unction is revealed by this conclusion to an argument about the revolutionary outbreak. The author fails completely to understand the enormous historical significance it would have, if, for once at least, the people of Russia taught the government a good lesson. Instead of showing the horrible price the people have paid and are still paying to absolutism, in order to rouse their hatred and indignation and instill in them a readiness and a passion for struggle, you talk about future sacrifices in order to frighten people away from the struggle. My good gentleman, it would be far better for you to refrain altogether from talking about the revolutionary outbreak than to ruin your reasoning with such a finale. Apparently, you do not wish to create great events, you merely want to talk about the shadow of great events, and then only with persons having access to the throne. Our legal press, as we know, is chock full of such talk with shadows and about shadows, and in order to give substance to the shadows, it has become fashionable to refer to the great reforms and to sing to them hallelujahs full of conventional lies. An author writing under the surveillance of the censor may sometimes be forgiven such lies, since otherwise he would never be able to express his striving for political reforms. But no censorship hovered over Mr. HNS. He writes, "The great reforms were not devised for the greater triumph of the bureaucracy." How evasive this apologetic phrase is! By whom devised? By Herzog, Chernyshevsky, Unkovsky, and those who marched with them? But these people demanded ever so much more than was effected by the reforms, and because of this they were persecuted by the government that introduced the great reforms, by the government and by those who followed it blindly singing its praises and snarling at the hotheads. But the government strove by every means in its power to concede as little as possible, and to curtail the democratic demands precisely for the greater triumph of the bureaucracy. Mr. BNS is well aware of these historical facts, and he obscures them only for the reason that they entirely refute his smug theory of the possible submission of the autocrat. There is no place for submissiveness in politics, and the time-honored police method of divide et impera, divide and rule, yield the unimportant in order to preserve the essential, give with one hand and take back with the other, can be mistaken for submission only out of unbounded simplicity, both sacred and sly simplicity. The government of Alexander II devised and introduced the great reforms. It did not at the same time deliberately set itself the aim of cutting off imperatively all the Russian people's legal roads to political liberty. It did not weigh its every step and every paragraph of the law with this end in view. This is untrue. The government of Alexander II, both in devising the reforms and in introducing them, set out from the very beginning to reject the demands for political freedom then put forward. From the beginning to the end it cut off every legal road to liberty, for it answered even simple appeals with repressions. It never even permitted liberty to be discussed freely. Suffice it to recall the facts mentioned in Whittier's memorandum, quoted above, to refute Mr. RNS's paeans of praise. Concerning the persons in the government of Alexander II, Whittier expresses himself, for example, as follows. It must be observed that the prominent statesmen of the 60s, whose celebrated names will be preserved by a grateful posterity, in their time did more that is great than anything their successors may have done. They toiled at the renovation of our state and social system from sincere conviction, not to frustrate the strivings of their ruler, but out of unbounded loyalty to him. p. 67 of the memorandum. What is true. From sincere conviction, out of unbounded loyalty to the ruler at the head of the police gang. After this we are not surprised that Mr. 2. NS says very little about the most important question of the role of the Zemstvos in the struggle for political liberty. Apart from the usual references to the practical and cultural work of the Zemstvo, he mentions in passing its educational political significance. He says that the Zemstvo has political significance, that the Zemstvo, as Mr. Whittier clearly sees, is dangerous to the present system only by virtue of the historical tendency of its development, as the embryo of a constitution. And, concluding these seemingly casual remarks, comes the following attack upon revolutionaries. We value Mr. Whittier's work, not only for the truth it tells about the autocracy, but also as a valuable political testimonial to the Zemstvo granted by the bureaucracy itself. This testimonial is an excellent reply to all those who, being devoid of political education or carried away by revolutionary phrases, have refused to see the enormous political significance of the Russian Zemstvos and their legal cultural activity, who has revealed a lack of education? Who is carried away? Where and when? With whom does Mr. RNS disagree? And why? To these questions no reply is forthcoming, and our author's attack is nothing but an expression of his antipathy towards revolutionaries, which we know from other passages in his essay. Matters are not clarified by the still stranger comment, by these words we do not desire to offend revolutionaries whose moral courage in the struggle against tyranny cannot be too highly estimated. Wherefore this remark? What connection is there between moral courage and inability to appreciate the Zemstvos? Mr. HNS has indeed fallen out of the frying pan into the fire. First he offended the revolutionaries by making an unsupported and anonymous, i.e., not known against whom leveled charge of ignorance and phrasemongering, and now he commits a fresh offense against them by assuming that they can be induced to swallow the charge of ignorance if the pill is sweetened by recognition of their moral courage. To complete the confusion, Mr. HNS contradicts himself by declaring, in chorus, as it were, with those who are carried away by revolutionary phrases, that the modern Russian Zemstvo is not a political magnitude that could impress or overawe anyone by its own direct power. It can barely maintain its own position. Only in the remote future and only as a result of the cultural development of the whole country could such institutions as the Zemstvo become a menace to this absolutist system. 6. Let us, however, try to analyze the issue on which Mr. RNS speaks so angrily and emptily. The facts we have cited above show that the political significance of the Zemstvos, i.e., their significance as a factor in the struggle for political freedom, lies principally in the following. First, these bodies of representatives of our propertied classes, particularly the landed aristocracy, forever contrapose elected institutions to the bureaucracy, give rise to constant conflicts between them, expose at every step the reactionary character of the irresponsible czarist officialdom, and foster discontent and opposition to the autocratic government. 20. Secondly, the Zemstvos, attached to the bureaucratic chariot like a superfluous fifth wheel, strive to consolidate their position, to increase their significance, and to obtain a constitution by petitioning, unconsciously march towards it, as Witte himself puts the matter. For that reason they are unsuitable as allies of the government in its fight against the revolutionaries. They maintain a benevolent neutrality towards the latter and render them undoubted, if indirect, service by causing the government to waver in its measures of repression at critical moments. Of course, institutions, which hitherto have proved that they are, at best, capable of making only liberal petitions and maintaining benevolent neutrality, cannot be regarded as an important, or to any degree an independent, factor in the political struggle, but it cannot be denied that the Zemstvos represent one of the auxiliary factors in the struggle. In this sense we are even prepared, if you will, to regard the Zemstvo as a piece of constitution. Perhaps the reader will say, then you agree with Mr. RNS, who does not claim any more for them? Not at all. It is only here that our difference with him begins. Let us admit for the sake of argument, that the Zemstvo is a piece of constitution. But it is precisely such a piece that was used to decoy Russian society away from a constitution. It is precisely such a relatively unimportant position that the autocracy has yielded to growing democracy in order to retain its hold on its principal positions, in order to divide and disunite those who demanded political reforms. We have seen how this policy of disuniting on the basis of confidence in the Zemstvo, the embryo of a constitution, succeeded in the 60s and in the years 1880-81. The question of the relation of the Zemstvos to political freedom is a particular case of the general question of the relation of reforms to revolution. This particular case serves to illustrate the narrow-mindedness and stupidity of the fashionable theory of Bernstein, 46, which substitutes reforms for revolutionary struggle and declares, e.g., through the mouth of Mr. Bourdieu, that the principle of progress is that the better things are, the better. This principle in its general form is as untrue as its reverse, that the worse things are, the better. Revolutionaries, of course, will never reject the struggle for reforms, the struggle to capture even minor and unimportant enemy positions, if these will serve to strengthen the attack and help to achieve full victory. But they will never forget that sometimes the enemy himself surrenders a certain position in order to disunite the attacking party and thus to defeat it more easily. They will never forget that only by constantly having the ultimate aim in view, only by appraising every step of the movement and every reform from the point of view of the general revolutionary struggle, is it possible to guard the movement against false steps and shameful mistakes. It is this aspect of the question, the significance of the Zemstvo as an instrument for strengthening the autocracy through half-concessions, as a means of bringing over a certain section of the liberals to the side of the autocracy, that Mr. RNS has completely failed to understand. He has preferred to invent for his own use a doctrinaire scheme by which the Zemstvos and the Constitution are connected by the straight line formula, the better things are, the better. If you first abolish the Zemstvos in Russia, he says, addressing himself to which and then increase the rights of the individual, you will lose the good opportunity of giving the country a moderate constitution growing historically out of local self-government with a socialist state appearance. At all events you will render the cause of conservatism a distinct disservice. What a beautiful and harmonious conception! Local self-government with a socialist state tinge. A wise conservative, having access to the throne. A moderate constitution. The unfortunate thing about it is that in actual practice, the wise conservatives have on more than one occasion, thanks to the Zemstvos, found good opportunities to withhold the constitution from the country. Mr. RNS's peaceful conception had its effect also on the slogan with which he concludes his essay, and which is printed in the manner of a slogan, as a separate line and in heavy type. Rights, and an authoritative all-Russian Zemstvo. It must be frankly acknowledged that this is the same sort of indecent flirting with the political prejudices of the broad masses of Russian liberals as Rabokai Muslims flirting with the political prejudices of the broad masses of the workers. We are duty-bound to raise a protest in the first as in the second case against such flirting. It is prejudice to believe that the government of Alexander II did not cut off the legal road to liberty, that the Zemstvos provide a good opportunity for granting a moderate constitution to the country, and that the slogan, rights, and an authoritative Zemstvo can serve as the banner of, we shall not say the revolutionary, but even the constitutional, movement. This is not a banner that can serve to distinguish enemies from allies, or help to direct and guide the movement. It is but a rag that can only help the most unreliable characters to creep into the movement, and assist the government to make still another attempt to come off with high-sounding promises and indecisive reforms. One need not be a prophet to be able to prophesy this. Our revolutionary movement will reach its apogee, the liberal ferment in society will increase tenfold, and other Loris Milikovs and Ignatyevs will appear in the government and inscribe on their banner, rights, and an authoritative Zemstvo. But if it came to pass, it would be the most unfavorable outcome for Russia and the most favorable for the government. If any considerable section of the liberals put their faith in that banner, and, allowing themselves to be carried away by it, attack the revolutionary hotheads in the rear, the latter may find themselves cut off, and the government will try to restrict itself to a minimum of concessions limited to something in the nature of an advisory and aristocratic constitution. Whether this attempt will be successful or not, depends upon the outcome of the decisive struggle between the revolutionary proletariat and the government, but of one thing we may be certain, the liberals will be betrayed. With the aid of slogans like those advanced by Mr. RNS, authoritative Zemstvo, etc., the government will decoy them like puppies away from the revolutionaries, only to take them by the scruff of the neck and thrash them with the whip of reaction. And when that happens, gentlemen, we will not forget to say, serves you right. Why, instead of a demand for the abolition of absolutism, is such a moderate and chastened wish put forward as ultimate slogan? First, for the sake of the Philistine doctrinarism that desires to render a service to conservatism and believes that the government will be softened by such moderation and be rendered submissive by it. Secondly, in order to unite the liberals. Indeed, the slogan, rights, and an authoritative Zemstvo can perhaps serve to unite all liberals in the same way as, in the opinion of the economists, the slogan, add a kopeck to each ruble 21 will unite all the workers. But will not such unity be a loss rather than a gain? Unity is an advantage when it raises those who are united to the level of the class-conscious and decisive program of the unifying force. Unity is a disadvantage when it lowers the unifying force to the level of the prejudices of the masses. Among Russian liberals there is undoubtedly a widespread prejudice that the Zemstvo is indeed the embryo of a constitution. 22. The natural, peaceful, and gradual growth of which is accidentally retarded by the intrigues of certain immoral time-servers. that only a few petitions are necessary in order to bring the autocrat to submission, that legal cultural work generally and Zemstvo work in particular have considerable political significance, relieving those who mouth verbal hostility to the autocracy of the obligation actively to support the revolutionary struggle against the autocracy in one way or another, and so forth, and so on. Undoubtedly, it would be very useful and desirable to unite the liberals, but the unity must be one whose purpose is to combat outworn prejudices and not to play up to them, to raise the general level of our political development, or rather underdevelopment, and not to sanction it. In a word, it must be a unity for the purpose of supporting the illegal struggle and not for the purpose of opportunistic phrase-mongering about the great political significance of legal activity. If there can be no justification for issuing to the workers the political slogan, freedom to strike, etc., then, by the same token, there can be no justification for issuing to the liberals the slogan, an authoritative Zemstvo. Under the autocracy, every kind of Zemstvo, however authoritative it may be, will inevitably be a deformity, incapable of development, while under a constitution the Zemstvo will immediately lose its present-day political significance. The unification of liberals is possible in two ways: by forming an independent liberal party, illegal, of course, or by organizing liberal aid for revolutionaries. Mr. RNS himself points to the first form, but, if what he says in this connection is to be taken as a genuine expression of the views and prospects of liberalism, then it does not give grounds for very great optimism. He writes, "Without a Zemstvo, the Zemstvo liberals will have to form a liberal party or abandon the historical stage as an organized force. We are convinced that the organization of liberals in an illegal party, even if its program and its methods are very moderate, will be the inevitable result of the abolition of the Zemstvo. If that is the case, we shall have to wait a long time, for even Guetta does not wish to abolish the Zemstvos, and as for the Russian government, it is very much concerned with preserving their outward form, even if their content is completely eliminated. That a liberal party will be a very moderate one is quite natural, and it is useless to expect that the movement among the bourgeoisie, for only on that movement can a liberal party be based, will give rise to any other. But what should be the activities and the methods of such a party? Mr. RNS does not explain. He says, an illegal liberal party, being an organization consisting of the most moderate and least mobile of the opposition elements, cannot by itself develop a particularly extensive, or particularly intensive, activity. We think, however, that in a certain sphere, although limited by local and above all by Zemstvo interests, the Liberal Party could very well develop an extensive and intensive activity, such as the organization of political exposures, but with such activity on the part of other parties, especially the Social Democratic or Working Class Party, the Liberal Party, even without entering into any direct agreement with the Social Democrats, can become a highly important factor. Very true, and the reader will naturally expect that the author would, at least in general outline, describe the work of this factor. But instead of doing so, Mr. RNS describes the growth of revolutionary social democracy and concludes, with the existence of a pronounced political movement, a liberal opposition, if it is in the least organized, can play an important political role. With proper tactics, a moderate party always stands to gain from an accentuated struggle between extreme social elements. That is all. The role of the factor which has already managed to convert itself from a party into an opposition is to take advantage of the growing acuteness of the struggle. Mention is made of what the liberals stand to gain, but not a word is said about the liberals taking part in the struggle. The slip of the tongue, one may say, is providential. The Russian Social Democrats never closed their eyes to the fact that the political liberties for which they are first and foremost fighting will benefit primarily the bourgeoisie. Only a socialist steeped in the worst prejudices of utopianism, or reactionary narodism, would for that reason object to carrying on the struggle against the autocracy. The bourgeoisie will benefit by these liberties and rest on its laurels. The proletariat, however, must have freedom in order to develop the struggle for socialism to the utmost. And social democracy will persistently carry on the struggle for liberation, regardless of the attitude of the various strata of the bourgeoisie towards it. In the interests of the political struggle, we must support every opposition to the oppressive autocracy, no matter on what grounds and in which social stratum it manifests itself. For that reason, we are by no means indifferent to the opposition expressed by our liberal bourgeoisie in general, and by our Zemstvo liberals in particular. If the liberals succeed in organizing themselves in an illegal party, so much the better. We shall welcome the growth of political consciousness among the propertied classes. We will support their demands. We will endeavor to work so that the activities of the liberals and the social democrats mutually supplement each other. 23. But even if they fail to do so, which is more probable, we shall not give them up as lost. We will endeavor to strengthen contacts with individual liberals, acquaint them with our movement, support them by exposing in the labor press all the despicable acts of the government and the local authorities, and try to induce them to support the revolutionaries. Such an exchange of services between liberals and social democrats is already proceeding. It must be extended and made permanent. But while always ready to carry on this exchange of services, we will never, under any circumstances, cease to carry on a determined struggle against the illusions that are so widespread in the politically undeveloped Russian society generally and among Russian liberals in particular. Paraphrasing the celebrated statement of Marx in regard to the revolution of I-848, we may say of the Russian revolutionary movement that its progress lies, not so much in the achievement of any positive gains, as in emancipation from harmful illusions. 47. We have emancipated ourselves from the illusions of anarchism and Narodnik socialism, from contempt for politics, from the belief in the exceptionalist development of Russia, from the conviction that the people are ready for revolution, and from the theory of the seizure of power and the duel-like combat between the autocracy and the heroic intelligentsia. It is time our liberals emancipated themselves from the illusion, theoretically untenable, one might assume, yet very tenacious in practice, that it is still possible to hold parley with the Russian autocracy, that some kind of Zemstvo is the embryo of a constitution, and that the sincere adherents of the constitution can fulfill their vow of Hannibal by patient legal activity and by patient appeals to the enemy to turn submissive.